Bumpy Johnson spent 11 years locked away in Alcatraz while the man he trusted like a son quietly stole everything he had ever built. The night he walked back into Harlem, he brought no army, no weapons, no warnings, just one quiet dinner reservation at the wrong restaurant on the wrong Friday night. What did Bumpy do that made 250 witnesses never forget his name? To understand how it all led, here we go back to where it truly began. Marcus "Smooth" Henderson laughed like a man who had never lost a single night of sleep in his life. It was a Friday night at Small's Paradise, 135th and 7th Avenue, the crown jewel of Harlem nightlife in the summer of 1963. The restaurant was a live jazz trio, warming up in the corner, waiters gliding between tables with trays of fried chicken and collard greens, the smell of bourbon and cigarette smoke hanging thick and sweet in the air. 250 people packed into a room that comfortably fit 200, and every single one of them knew who owned this night. Smooth sat at table 7, the corner booth in the back, the seat with the perfect view of the entire room and both exits. He wore a cream-colored suit that had cost more than most Harlem families earned in a month. 3 diamond rings caught the light every time he lifted his glass of French cognac. His gold watch, Swiss imported, the kind you ordered through a man who knew a man, gleamed at his wrist. Around him, 4 men sat like sentinels. Big, well-fed, expensive-looking men who smiled when Smooth smiled and went still when Smooth went still. Smooth was 38 years old, and he looked like someone had handed him the world on a silver platter and asked him to hold it while they went to get more. "You know what I love about Friday nights," he said, to no one in particular, swirling his cognac with the slow confidence of a man who had nowhere to be and nothing to fear. "Friday nights, Harlem remembers who she belongs to." His crew laughed. The right people laughed. The music played. Another round of drinks arrived without anyone having to ask. This was the kingdom Marcus Henderson had built. 5 policy banks running numbers across Harlem. 40 men on his payroll. A penthouse apartment in Mount Morris Park with a view that went all the way to Central Park on a clear day. The Genovese family's blessing to operate as long as the weekly tribute arrived on time, and it always did, because Smooth understood one thing above everything else. Stay useful to powerful people, and powerful people will let you live. Well, for 11 years this had been his life. For 11 years, table 7 at Small's Paradise had been his throne. For 11 years he had slept peacefully, eaten well, and told himself the story that men who betray their mentors always tell themselves eventually, that he had deserved it all along, that the opportunity had simply presented itself, that any smart man would have done the same. He had almost started to believe it. That was when the door opened and Danny "Dice" Rollins came in from the street, moving fast, moving wrong. Dice was one of Smooth's street lieutenants, a man who had spent 6 years perfecting the art of looking unbothered in every situation. He did not look unbothered now. He crossed the restaurant in 15 steps, leaned down close to Smooth's ear, and said 4 words in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper. "He got out today." Smooth did not move for 3 full seconds. Then, very slowly, he set his cognac glass down on the table. The diamond rings made a soft clicking sound against the rim. Around him, his crew kept laughing at something, not yet aware that the temperature of the entire evening had just dropped 10 degrees. When Smooth said, "Not a question," a word placed carefully in the air like a man testing ice before he steps onto a frozen river. "This morning. San Francisco. He's on a train." Dice paused. "Junie Bird picked up the phone an hour ago. We don't know who he called." Smooth looked down at his hands. The diamond rings, the gold watch, the cream-colored suit, everything he had built, everything he had taken, everything he had told himself he deserved all of it, suddenly felt like it was sitting on the wrong foundation. "Go back to your post," Smooth said quietly, "and find out who Junie called." Dice left. Smooth picked up his cognac glass again. He took a long, slow sip, and when he set it back down, he was smiling, the practiced, easy smile of a man who had learned to wear his face like a mask. But his right hand, hidden beneath the table, was trembling, because Marcus Henderson knew exactly what he had done. And now, after 11 years of almost forgetting, he was being reminded that some debts do not expire. Some reckonings simply wait. What Smooth had done was not a moment of weakness or a decision made under pressure. It was a choice, deliberate, calculated, and made in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1952, when Bumpy Johnson had been sitting across from him at this very restaurant, eating the same ribs, drinking the same bourbon, and trusting the wrong man with everything he had built. Bumpy Johnson had not chosen Smooth by accident. In 1947, when Marcus Henderson was a sharp, hungry 22-year-old from 118th Street with quick hands and a quicker mind, Bumpy had pulled him out of the small games and put him in the real ones. He taught him the numbers business from the ground up, how to run policy banks, how to manage collectors, how to read a street before the street read you. He introduced him to the right people, shielded him from Dutch Schultz's remaining crew when they came looking for revenge, and treated him less like an employee and more like a son he had never had. The trust Bumpy extended was not the cautious arm's-length trust of a man protecting his interests. It was the dangerous kind, the kind that makes a man show you where everything is buried. Smooth had learned every location of every cash house in Harlem. He knew which police captains were on Bumpy's payroll and exactly how much each one cost. He knew the names of the Genovese family contacts Bumpy had negotiated with the terms of their arrangement and the precise boundaries that kept the peace between Harlem and downtown. He knew all of this because Bumpy had trusted him enough to teach him, and Smooth had accepted that education with two hands while quietly planning how to use it for himself. When Bumpy was arrested in 1952 on conspiracy charges, he called Smooth from the holding cell. "Hold it together," Bumpy said. "Keep the banks running. Take care of May. I'll be out in 2 years, maybe 3. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who had been through bad nights before and expected to walk out the other side. Smooth said, "I'll handle everything. You have my word." For 2 years, he did exactly that. Money went to May. The banks kept running. The organization held. And then on a Thursday morning in 1954, Smooth sat down with a man named Carlo Ricci, a Genovese family captain who handled Harlem business and sold 11 years of Bumpy Johnson's work for the price of a single territory and a weekly tribute arrangement that made Smooth a very comfortable man. He gave Ricci the cash house locations. He gave him the names of the police captains and what it would take to flip their loyalty. He told them where the money moved, how it moved, and who moved it. He handed over the architecture of an entire empire piece by piece, like a man selling furniture out of someone else's house. 2 weeks later, federal agents raided 4 of Bumpy's remaining operations using information that had never been in any police file. Bumpy's lawyers could not explain it. Bumpy himself could not explain it. The sentence came down heavy: Alcatraz, the island prison in San Francisco Bay where the government sent the men it most wanted to forget about. 11 years. Smooth had stood at the back of the courtroom the day the sentence was read and watched Bumpy Johnson get walked out in handcuffs. Bumpy had turned once, scanning the room with those cold, still eyes. Smooth had looked away. He had not looked back since, until tonight when the ice beneath him cracked for the first time in 11 years. 3,000 miles away and 3 days earlier, the gates of Alcatraz had opened at 8 o'clock in the morning on June 7th, 1963, and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had walked out carrying everything he owned in a single paper bag. He was 56 years old. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and there were new lines in his face that had not been there when he went in. His suit, the same charcoal gray one he had worn to his sentencing, hung slightly loose on a frame that 11 years of institutional food had made leaner. He looked to the 2 guards, watching him leave like an old man who had served his time and would spend his remaining years causing no one any trouble. They were not good at reading people. Bumpy did not stop to breathe the outside air, did not pause at the gate to look back at the building that had held him for 11 years. He picked up his paper bag, walked to the waiting car, and got in. The driver, a man who owed a favor to a man who owed a favor to Junie Bird, drove him to the train station without asking any questions. On the 3-day train ride from San Francisco back to New York, Bumpy Johnson did not sleep more than 4 hours in total. He sat by the window and watched America pass by outside, the mountains, the plains, the small towns lit up at night like scattered stars, and he thought, not with anger, not with urgency, with the patient architectural clarity of a man who had spent 11 years with nothing to do but think. He had not wasted a single day. He arrived in New York on the morning of June 10th and went straight to Junie Bird's apartment on 145th Street. Junie was 63 now, gray-haired and moving slower than he used to, but his eyes were the same, sharp, loyal, the eyes of a man who had spent 11 years watching and waiting and keeping count. Bumpy walked in without knocking. He did not embrace Junie, did not sit down, did not ask about the weather or the neighborhood or what had changed. He stood in the middle of the small living room, still holding his paper bag, and said 2 words. "Give me names." Junie had a handwritten list ready, 15 names organized not alphabetically but by degree of damage done. He read them slowly, and Bumpy listened without interrupting, without reacting, his face as still and unreadable as the surface of deep water. He listened to the first name, nodded. The second, nodded. The third, fourth, fifth, each one received the same small, unhurried acknowledgement, the nod of a man filing information in a system that had been running continuously for 11 years and was only now receiving new input. Then Junie said the sixth name, Marcus Henderson. The room changed. Not because Bumpy said anything he didn't. Not because he moved, he was perfectly still. But something shifted in the quality of his silence, the way a clear sky shifts in the seconds before a storm arrives. Junie stopped reading. He looked up from his list. Bumpy was staring at a point on the wall above Junie's left shoulder, and whatever he was seeing, it was not the wall. Then the moment passed. Bumpy looked back at Junie. He nodded once, the same small, controlled nod, and said, "Keep going." Junie read the remaining 9 names. When he finished, Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Where does Henderson eat Small's Paradise?" Junie said. "Every Friday night. Table 7. Shows up at 9 o'clock like a clock you could set your watch to." Bumpy looked at the window. Outside, Harlem was alive with the noise of a Tuesday morning taxi horns, music drifting from somewhere, the voices of people who had no idea that anything had changed. "Book me a table," Bumpy said. Next to his. Friday night. He spent the next 3 days not doing what anyone expected him to do. He did not call meetings, did not make announcements, did not send word through the neighborhood that he was back, which would have been the natural move, a statement, a signal, a reclaiming of presence. Instead, Bumpy Johnson moved through Harlem like a man who had simply come to take a walk. He sat in a barber shop on 126th Street for 2 hours, saying almost nothing, listening to 3 different conversations happening simultaneously. He stood outside a numbers parlor on Lenox Avenue and watched the rhythm of the street. Who came, who went, how long they stayed, whether the lookout on the corner was paying attention or checking the time. He sat at the counter of a diner near 121st and drank coffee for 40 minutes, watching the reflection in the window of the block behind him. He was reading Harlem the way a doctor reads a patient, not looking for what was visible, but for what the visible things revealed about what was happening underneath. Every street told him something. Every face confirmed something. Every small shift in the geography of power left a trace that 11 years of careful observation had trained him to see. What he saw did not surprise him. It confirmed what he already knew. The surface of things had changed, new faces, new arrangements, new hierarchies built on the foundation of his absence. But the structure underneath the bones of everything he had built was still there, still recognizable, still in the deepest sense his. On Friday morning, he pressed his charcoal gray suit, the same one, the only one, and polished his scuffed shoes until they reflected a version of themselves that was better than the original. He ate a small breakfast alone. He read the newspaper. At 7 o'clock in the evening, he put on his jacket, checked that the straight razor he had carried since 1935 was in his right breast pocket, and walked out the door. He arrived at Small's Paradise at 10 minutes before 9 o'clock at night, alone on foot, dressed in a suit that had seen better days. He carried nothing else. The doorman saw him first. The man's hand moved automatically toward the door, and then he stopped, recognition crossing his face like a slow wave breaking on shore. He stepped aside without a word, without being asked, and held the door open with the specific kind of deference that is reserved not for men who ask for respect, but for men who simply are respect. Bumpy walked in. The restaurant did not go silent. That would have been too simple, too theatrical, and Harlem had always been a place that expressed its deepest feelings in subtler frequencies. What happened instead was a shift the way a room shifts when a window is opened and the air pressure changes. Conversations continued, but they lost their center. Eyes moved without meaning to. A waiter stopped mid-stride for half a second before correcting himself and moving on. The jazz trio kept playing, but the pianist missed a note he would not have missed under any other circumstance. Word moved through the room the way electricity moves through a wire, instantly and visibly, and with absolute certainty of direction. Old-timers knew him the moment they saw him. They recognized the walk, the posture, the particular quality of stillness that surrounded Bumpy Johnson, the way weather surrounds a mountain. Men who had been in Harlem long enough to remember what it felt like when he ran. It felt something they could not name. Something between relief and gravity, the sensation of a world returning to its correct orientation after years of being subtly wrong. Younger men, men who had come up in his absence and knew him only as a story. A legend whispered between older hustlers the way children whisper about kings from history books. Watched him cross the room with the uncertain reverence of people, witnessing something they had been told about but never expected to see with their own eyes. "That's Bumpy Johnson," someone murmured 3 tables away. "I thought he was gone," another voice said. "He was gone," came the answer. "Now he's back." Bumpy walked straight to table 8, the booth directly beside table 7, and sat down with his back to the wall and his eyes on the entrance. 3 men were already seated there: Junie Bird, Willie Fish Jackson, and Raymond Quick Lewis. Old men now, all of them gray and slower than they had once been, but present. Loyal in the way that only time can confirm loyalty, not through declarations, but through the simple fact of still being there. Bumpy sat. He did not look at the entrance with urgency. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already decided about, calmly, with a patience that had nothing left to prove. At exactly 9 o'clock in the evening, the door of Small's Paradise opened again. Marcus Smooth Henderson walked in wearing a cream-colored suit, with a burgundy tie, and diamonds on 3 fingers, laughing at something one of his men had said, his gold watch catching the light as he moved through the room. He had 4 men with him, large, well-dressed, confident men who moved with the practiced ease of people who had never had reason to be nervous in this room. Smooth was still laughing when his eyes swept the restaurant in the automatic scan that powerful men develop over years of entering rooms they own. The laugh stopped, not gradually, immediately, like a sound that has been cut off at the source. His feet slowed. His body registered what his mind was still processing, going still in the specific way that bodies go still when they receive information that changes everything. At table 8 inches, a charcoal gray suit with scuffed shoes and 11 years of Alcatraz behind him, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was sitting with his back to the wall, looking directly at Marcus Henderson, with eyes that had not changed a single degree in 11 years. Smooth had 4 armed men beside him. The restaurant held 250 witnesses. He had the Genovese families backing 40 men on his payroll, and 11 years of consolidated power behind him. None of it felt like enough. Bumpy did not stand, did not raise his voice, did not reach for anything. He simply looked at the man who had taken everything from him and said quietly enough that only those closest could hear, and clearly enough that everyone else understood from the silence surrounding it, "Marcus, come sit with me." It was not a request. Smooth had 4 armed men beside him, and a paper bag's worth of belongings, and a straight razor in his breast pocket that had been waiting 11 years for exactly this moment, and he was smiling. For 3 full seconds, nobody in Small's Paradise moved. Smooth's 4 men had read their boss's face the moment it changed, and their hands had moved to their waistbands, with the automatic efficiency of men who had spent years training their bodies to react before their minds finished thinking. Leon, the largest of them, a thick-necked enforcer from the Bronx who had broken things professionally since the age of 19, stepped forward and placed himself between Smooth and table 8 with the practiced certainty of a man who believed that his size was the final word in any argument. It was not the final word tonight. Because at table 8, the moment Leon stepped forward, 3 old men moved with a speed that had no business existing in bodies that old. Junie Bird's hand came up from beneath the table holding a .45 automatic that looked like it had been waiting 11 years for exactly this moment. Willie Fish Jackson produced a sawed-off shotgun from under the table with the casual ease of a man revealing a card he had been holding all evening. Raymond Quick Lewis had his revolver leveled at Leon's chest before the big man had completed his step, and he held it with the steady, unhurried grip of someone who had long since made peace with what the weapon was for. The jazz trio stopped playing. Not gradually, one by one, each musician simply stopped when he understood what he was looking at until the last note died in the middle of a phrase and left behind a silence so complete it had physical weight. Waiters backed toward the kitchen wall. Customers at the nearest tables went absolutely still, some with forks halfway to their mouths, suspended in the precise posture of people who have decided that not moving is the single best decision available to them. 250 people held their breath inside a room where at any other moment on any other Friday night, the only tension was whether the ribs would run out before midnight. In the center of all of it at table 8, Bumpy Johnson had not moved a single inch. He had not reached for anything, had not shifted his posture or changed his expression or given any physical indication whatsoever that the situation around him was anything other than a quiet dinner between old friends. He sat with his hands visible on the table, his back against the wall, his eyes on Marcus Henderson, and on his face was an expression of such complete and total patience that it was in its own way the most unsettling thing in the room, more unsettling than the guns, more unsettling than the silence, the absolute immovable calm of a man who had already decided how this evening ended and was simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion. Leon Smooth said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Leon did not look away from Junie's 45. Mr. Henderson, you don't take meetings without Leon. The second time was quieter but carried something the first had not. A finality. An instruction delivered not by volume but by weight. Take the others. Go wait outside. Leon turned to look at his boss. Something passed between them, a silent negotiation conducted entirely in the language of eyes and posture, the kind of communication that exists between men who have been in dangerous rooms together long enough to understand each other, without words. Leon did not want to leave. Everything in his body said so. But everything in Smooth's face said something else, that there was no version of this night, where a confrontation between armed men in a crowded restaurant ended well for Marcus Henderson, and that the only move available to a man in his position was the one that kept options open. Smooth was afraid, and Leon could see it. And fear in this particular room on this particular night was the most accurate intelligence available. Outside, Leon said to the other three. He held Junie's gaze for one more second, the pride of a man making clear that he was choosing to leave, not being made to, and then turned and walked toward the door. The three others followed. The door swung shut behind them. The guns stayed on the table. Junie and Willie and Quick did not put them away, but they settled, held with the relaxed readiness of men who understood that the crisis had just changed its shape rather than passed. Smooth stood alone between the two tables in his cream-colored suit with his diamond rings and his gold watch, and 11 years of someone else's empire on his back, looking at Bumpy Johnson the way a man looks at something he spent a decade pretending did not exist. Bumpy gestured to the chair across from him. One hand, one simple motion, the gesture of a man who has extended an invitation and expects it to be accepted. Smooth sat down. The shift that followed was almost cinematic in its precision, the way the room exhaled without quite relaxing, the way attention in every corner redirected itself toward table 8, while bodies remained carefully, strategically still. Bumpy raised 2 fingers toward the nearest waiter, a young man of perhaps 20 who was performing a very convincing impression of someone who had not been listening to anything. "Bring us a plate of ribs," Bumpy said. "The good ones." "And 2 glasses of bourbon." The waiter left at a pace that was technically still walking. Neither man spoke while they waited. Smooth's hands were on the table, and they were not entirely steady. He looked at Bumpy's face and then looked away, and then looked back, unable to settle on a posture that felt safe because there was no posture that felt safe. Bumpy looked at Smooth the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved, with a kind of detached analytical attention that was somehow worse than anger would have been. Anger could be reasoned with. Anger burned itself out. What was in Bumpy Johnson's eyes had no temperature at all. The food arrived. Ribs still steaming, glazed with a dark sauce that smelled of molasses and smoke. 2 glasses of bourbon, neat, no ice. The waiter set everything down with the careful, deliberate movements of a man disarming something, and then he was gone. Bumpy pushed the plate toward Smooth. "Eat," he said. Smooth looked at the ribs, then at Bumpy, then at the ribs again. "I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. Bumpy, it's a meal between 2 men who have known each other a long time." Bumpy's voice was quiet, conversational, stripped of everything that might be called threat, and therefore more threatening than any raised voice could have been. "Eat." Smooth picked up a rib with fingers that were not quite steady and held it without bringing it to his mouth. It was in every sense the saddest thing in the room. "I can explain," Smooth said. "I know you can," Bumpy said. "You've had 11 years to prepare that explanation. I'd like to hear it." And so Smooth talked. He talked the way men talk when they are terrified and have convinced themselves that the right combination of words can still change the outcome. Fast at first, then slower, rearranging the story as he told it, feeling for the version that landed best, the version where he was not a man who made a choice but a man who had been given no other option. He said the Genovese family had come to him, not the other way around. He said they had made clear that Bumpy's operations were going to be dismantled with or without his cooperation, and that his only choice was whether to go down with the ship or survive. He said he had tried to protect as many of Bumpy's people as he could. He said the money that was supposed to go to May Bumpy's wife that had stopped arriving after the first 2 years had been held back for operational reasons, reinvested into keeping the organization functional, and that he had always intended to make it right. He said he had thought about Bumpy every day. He said he was sorry. Bumpy listened to all of it. He did not interrupt, did not change his expression. He sat with his hands folded on the table, perfectly still, and gave Smooth the complete, undivided attention that the speech deserved, which was the same attention a doctor gives to a patient's description of symptoms, not because the description will change the diagnosis, but because the way a man describes his own illness tells you something important about what kind of man he is. When Smooth finished, a silence settled over the table. Then Bumpy spoke. "They came to you," he said. "Yes. With an offer. It wasn't really an offer. It was..." "What was the number?" Bumpy asked. Simple, direct. The question of a man who has done accounting. Smooth's mouth opened, closed. "Bumpy, what did they pay you for my cash houses? The locations, the collector routes, the police contacts. What was the number?" It wasn't about the money, Marcus. Not loud, not angry, just precise the way a blade is precise. What was the number? The silence that followed was the kind that tells the truth before words do. Smooth looked down at the table. When he spoke again, the performance was gone, the practiced grief, the careful framing, the architecture of a story built over 11 years to make one decision sound like something other than what it was. What was left underneath was smaller and more honest. 40,000, Smooth said. "And the territory?" 125th Street. Bumpy nodded slowly. $40,000, he said. "And a street. That's what 11 years cost. I was going to pay it back. I always planned. You planned nothing of the kind." Bumpy's voice did not rise. It simply became more precise, the way a beam of light becomes more precise when it is focused through glass. "You planned to keep it. You planned for me to stay in Alcatraz long enough that the plan would become permanent. And when the years started stacking up and I didn't come home, you stopped planning entirely because you decided the question had answered itself." Smooth said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Because the truth, when it is spoken plainly by someone who knows it completely, does not leave room for revision. Then Bumpy leaned forward slightly and his voice dropped to something just above a murmur, a register that forced Smooth to lean in to hear it, which meant that what came next arrived at close range unavoidably with nowhere to deflect. "Tell me about the arrest," Bumpy said. Smooth went very still. "The 1,952 arrest," Bumpy continued, his eyes steady, his voice as level as a horizon. "The federal raid. 4 locations all hit within the same 2-hour window. Coordinated. Precisi. Using information that had never appeared in a single police file, never been discussed outside of 2 people, you and me." He paused. "The Genovese family didn't find that information on their own, Marcus. And federal agents don't develop that kind of operational intelligence through routine investigation." Another pause, longer this time, and in the space of it the entire restaurant seemed to compress inward, every ear in the building, straining toward a conversation that only 2 men were having. Someone gave it to them. The cream-colored suit, the diamond rings, the gold watch. All of it seemed to lose its color in the seconds that followed, as though the light in the room had shifted. Smooth started. "Don't." The word landed like a door closing. "Do not tell me another version of a story where you had no choice. I've listened to one of those tonight and I gave it more patience than it deserved. Tell me the truth. One time. Right now. In this room. What happened next was something that 250 people in Small's Paradise would spend the rest of their lives describing in different ways, the moment, the expression, the precise sequence of what was said and what was not said. Some would remember Smooth crying. Some would remember him going pale. Some would remember him simply deflating the way a structure deflates when the thing holding its shape is removed. What was consistent in every telling was this. Marcus Henderson looked at Bumpy Johnson across a plate of untouched ribs and 2 glasses of bourbon, and he told the truth. He had not waited for the Genovese family to come to him. He had gone to them. In the winter of 1951, 8 months before Bumpy's arrest, Smooth had made his first contact with Carlo Ricci through an intermediary, a move so careful, so measured, so deliberately constructed to leave no trace that it had taken him 3 months to complete what could have been done in a popless week. He had offered them Bumpy's complete operational infrastructure in exchange for guaranteed protection and territorial rights. The $40,000 had been agreed upon. The territory on 125th Street had been promised. And then, to fulfill his end of the arrangement, Smooth had made 3 phone calls to a federal contact, whose name he did not share, and never would calls, that provided the precise locations, the timing windows, and the names necessary to dismantle Bumpy Johnson's operation in a single coordinated action. The arrest had not found Bumpy by accident. It had been designed, engineered, delivered. Smooth had not simply taken advantage of Bumpy's absence. He had manufactured it. The room absorbed this revelation in complete silence. Bumpy sat with it for a long moment, his face unchanged, his hands still folded on the table. Then he did something that no one in the restaurant expected, something that was more unsettling than any expression of anger could have been. He nodded. Once, slowly. The nod of a man who has just received the final piece of information needed to complete a picture he had been assembling for 11 years. "Thank you," Bumpy said quietly, for saying it plainly. He unfolded his hands, reached into his right breast pocket, and placed on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something that carries history in its weight. A straight razor, pearl-handled, worn smooth, from decades of use, the steel blade catching the restaurant light in a thin, clean arc. He did not open it immediately. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at the room, not at Smooth, but at the room itself. All 250 people who had come to Small's Paradise on a Friday night expecting jazz and ribs and the comfortable rituals of Harlem nightlife, and had instead been handed a front row seat to something that would be talked about on these streets for the next 40 years. When Bumpy spoke, he spoke to all of them. "I want every person in this room to understand something." His voice was not loud, but it carried the way voices carry in spaces where everyone has chosen silence. When I went away, some people in this neighborhood made decisions. They decided that gone meant finished, that absent meant forgotten, that a man's life's work was available for the taking if the man himself was somewhere he couldn't protect it. He paused. Let it settle. Those people were wrong about what kind of man I am. And tonight, some of you need to see what being wrong about that costs. He stood up. Smooth scrambled backward instinctively, the chair scraping against the floor, his hands coming up, and then Junie was behind him, not touching him, not threatening him, simply present in the specific way that made it clear that the available options had just been reduced to one. Smooth stood. His legs were barely holding him. His face under the restaurant lights was the face of a man experiencing the complete and total collapse of 11 years of distance between himself and the thing he had spent 11 years trying not to think about. Bumpy walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Marcus Henderson, close enough that the two men could have been having a private conversation. He opened the razor. The steel caught the light. And then, with a precision that spoke of something almost surgical, something that required steadiness of hand and absolute clarity of intention, Bumpy made a single motion, one clean line across the left side of Smooth's face. Not deep, not dangerous, precisely calibrated to do exactly one thing: remain. The sound Smooth made was not loud. The mark itself was not dramatic. But in the silence of that room with 250 witnesses watching the act carried a weight that had nothing to do with its physical dimensions. This was not punishment. Punishment implies that the account is settled afterward. What Bumpy had just done was something different, something permanent, something designed not to end the story but to write it into Smooth skin so that every mirror, every face that looked at him for the rest of his life would continue telling it. "That's so you remember," Bumpy said quietly, close enough that only Smooth could hear the words, though the room strained for them. "And so everyone who sees you will know what you did." He folded the razor, returned it to his breast pocket with the same careful deliberateness with which he had removed it, straightened his jacket, turned to the room one final time. "Bumpy Johnson is back," he said simply. "The rules are the same as they've always been. Pay what you owe. Keep your word. Protect your people." He let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. Anyone who needs a reminder of what the alternative looks like, you've just seen it. Then he turned and walked toward the door, not quickly, not slowly, with the unhurried even pace of a man who has completed what he came to do and has no reason to rush toward anything that comes next. Junie fell into step slightly behind his right shoulder. Willie and Quick followed. The four old men moved through the frozen restaurant like a tide, going out, steady, inevitable, complete. At the door, Bumpy did not pause, did not look back, did not offer any final gesture or word or acknowledgement that 250 people were watching him leave. He simply walked out and the door swung shut behind him, and the night on 135th Street received him without ceremony and swallowed him whole. For a long moment, nobody in Small's paradise moved or spoke. Marcus Henderson stood at table 8, one hand pressed to the left side of his face, his cream-colored suit marked in a way that no dry cleaner in New York City would ever fully correct. The ribs on the plate between the two bourbon glasses had gone cold. Then somewhere in the back of the room, someone exhaled, and the restaurant began slowly and incompletely to breathe again. By the time the first whispers started moving between tables, Bumpy Johnson was already 3 blocks away, walking north through Harlem in the warm June night, unhurried and unremarkable, just another man on a street that had always been his. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the rooftops of the brownstones along Lenox Avenue, 3 men who had carved pieces of Bumpy's territory in his absence packed whatever they could carry and left Harlem without telling anyone where they were going. They had not been summoned, had not been threatened, had not received any message of any kind from anyone connected to Bumpy Johnson. They had simply been at Small's paradise the night before, and they understood in the way that people understand things that they have witnessed, rather than been told that what they had seen at table 8 was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Marcus Smooth Henderson was on a bus to Philadelphia by noon the following day. He took one bag. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He did not attempt to collect what remained of his money, did not make calls to his lieutenants, did not try to negotiate any version of a graceful exit. He simply left the way men leave when they understand that the city they are in has already decided it is finished with them. The 3 other men who had disappeared before sunrise that same morning had reached the same conclusion independently, without coordination, without anyone telling them to go. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about the 72 hours that followed the night at Small's paradise, how little Bumpy Johnson had to do. No orders were issued. No ultimatums delivered. No meetings called. The architecture of power in Harlem simply began correcting itself the way a building corrects itself after the false supports are removed and the original load-bearing structures are allowed to do what they were always designed to. Policy bankers who had been operating under Smooth's arrangement sent word that they were ready to discuss new terms. Street lieutenants who had transferred their loyalty during the 11 years quietly transferred it back, not through declarations, but through the small practical gestures that constitute real allegiance. Information shared, tribute rerouted, names provided without being asked. The neighborhood understood what had happened at table 8, and the neighborhood drew its own conclusions. Real fear, Bumpy had always known, is not produced by violence. It is produced by certainty, by the demonstrated unambiguous knowledge that a man means exactly what he says and will do exactly what he has promised. Harlem had been reminded of that certainty on a Friday night, and 72 hours later the reminder was still working. It was on the 3rd day that the Genovese family sent a man. He arrived at the barber shop on 126th Street, where Bumpy had taken to spending his mornings, a quiet, well-dressed captain named Vincent, who carried himself with the careful dignity of someone representing interests larger than himself. He sat across from Bumpy in a chair that the barber had vacated without being asked, and he placed his hands flat on his knees in the universal posture of a man who has come to talk, not to threaten. Bumpy listened to the opening. An acknowledgement that certain arrangements made during his absence had perhaps extended beyond what was appropriate. A suggestion that both parties might benefit from a new understanding. The careful diplomatic language of men who negotiate at the level where the words used matter less than the realities they gesture toward. Bumpy let him finish. Then he said, "Everything north of 110th Street. 2 weeks to complete the withdrawal. That's the conversation." Vincent looked at him for a moment. "There are interests that would need to be." 2 weeks, Bumpy said. He did not say it louder, did not add anything to it. He simply let it stand in the air between them the way a fact stands, not requiring defense or elaboration, requiring only acknowledgement. The meeting lasted 4 minutes. Vincent left without ordering coffee. 3 days later, the first Genovese-connected operation north of 110th Street began the quiet process of closing. Within 2 weeks, they were gone. Not because Bumpy had more men or more firepower or more political connections than the most powerful organized crime family in New York City, but because the family understood in the cold language of risk and return that the cost of holding territory against a man like Bumpy Johnson was higher than the territory was worth. They had lost 3 associates in the week following his return, not to violence directed by Bumpy, but to the cascading consequences of a neighborhood that had reoriented itself overnight. The math was simple. The decision was simpler. Within 6 months, every piece of what Bumpy had built was back under his hand, not recovered through war, not reclaimed through bloodshed, but restored through the patient, inevitable logic of a man who had spent 11 years doing nothing but preparing for exactly this. There is something worth sitting with in that. Something that goes beyond the particulars of Harlem in 1963, beyond the specific men and the specific deaths and the specific night at Small's Paradise that became a legend before the weekend was over. Because what Bumpy Johnson demonstrated in those 6 months really demonstrated underneath all the drama and the razor and the untouched plate of ribs was a principle about the nature of power that most people spend their entire lives misunderstanding. Power is not loud. It does not announce itself, or perform itself, or require an audience to exist. The men who need to remind people constantly of their strength are the men whose strength requires the reminder. Real power is quiet, patient, and deeply certain, certain in the way that gravity is certain, not because it forces anything, but because it simply is consistently and without exception, and everything else arranges itself accordingly. Bumpy Johnson was not the most feared man in Harlem because he was the most dangerous. He was the most feared because he was the most consistent. Because in 30 years of navigating one of the most treacherous landscapes in American life, he had never once said something he did not mean or promised something he did not deliver. His word was a contract that had never been broken. His patience was a weapon that had never been exhausted. And his intelligence, cold, precise, always 3 moves ahead of the room, was the thing that made all the rest of it possible. You can lock a man in a cell for 11 years. You can take his money, divide his territory, turn his people toward other loyalties, build an entire world on the foundation of his absence. But you cannot imprison the quality of mind that built the thing in the first place. You cannot confiscate patience. You cannot sentence intelligence to time served. Marcus Henderson had taken everything that was visible, and in doing so had left untouched the only thing that actually mattered. That is the lesson that echoed out from Table 8 at Small's Paradise on the night of June 10th, 1963. Not about crime, not about Harlem, not about any world most people will ever inhabit, but about the irreducible truth that what a person has built inside themselves cannot be taken by anyone who acts on the outside. The throne was never in the territory. It was never in the cash houses or the policy banks or the 40 men on the payroll. It was in the man himself, patient and certain and waiting, counting days in a cell on an island in San Francisco Bay, knowing something that everyone who had forgotten him did not know, that he was coming back, and that when he did, everything would remember where it belonged. Some debts have no expiration date. And some kings never stop being king, not because the crown is never removed, but because the crown was never what made them one.